Hi everyone, my name is Claire and I'm the Programs and Operations Lead at Cycle Toronto. I'm here with Tony Lafazanis, who has over 35 years of personal injury law experience. He's currently based out of Cabbagetown, and he's a cyclist himself, and he's also a Cycle Toronto business member. He's going to be chatting with us today about compensating cyclists. So Tony, I'll pass it off to you now.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction, and thank you to Cycle Toronto for inviting me to speak about compensating cyclists. Cycling in Toronto today has exploded. The trend started for sure before COVID, but with COVID has accelerated. We've seen a tremendous expansion of new bike lanes in our city, and with all of these changes, more and more people jumping on their bikes and getting around. What that does, of course, is also create greater risks of cyclists being involved in some sort of accident or injury-causing event. Next slide, please. Now, there are many avenues for obtaining compensation if a cyclist is hurt in an accident. If the accident has any involvement, with or without contact, with a motor vehicle, then benefits called accident benefits are available. There's a claim called a tort claim, which is a separate entitlement, including pain and suffering, and that would be against somebody else that is either completely at fault or even partly at fault. Other types of claims are if you're unable to work, short-term and long-term disability. People often have those through their group plans through work, but many also have private disability insurance. EI sick benefits, T4 employee pays into those, and those are available to a maximum of 15 weeks. Lastly, Canada Pension Disability Benefits and also Ontario Disability Support Plan benefits are another alternative and type of claim that can be pursued. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about a few different types of accidents, and we'll start with the most common. As the slide indicates, the most common accident is any contact with a motor vehicle. The usual situation, and hopefully the situation, is where the driver is present and you're able to obtain the particulars of the driver in their insurance policy. Unfortunately, there are many other accidents where the motorist has left the scene, commonly called a hit and run. Next slide, please. Now, just to talk about hit and run accidents, lawyers refer to that as an unidentified vehicle accident. The first place to look for coverage is your own motor vehicle insurance. If you do not have access to your own, and by own I mean you personally have it, or a member of your family, or perhaps through work, that's your own motor vehicle insurance. If you unfortunately don't have access to any of those, there's always access to the Motor Vehicle Accident Claims Fund, which is an Ontario government fund for situations where an injured person, where a vehicle is involved, does not have access to their own motor vehicle insurance. Next slide, please. Now, the more uncommon types of accidents are the often accident scenarios that I receive calls about, and people are simply not aware as to whether or not they can seek out some compensation. I've listed at least 5 of those, and we'll talk about each. The first, car causes bike to lose control. So here there's no contact with the vehicle, but because of the actions of the vehicle, the bike, the cyclist loses control and has an injury. That is treated the same as what we've already discussed, which is the situation where there's contact. So even without contact, if there's good evidence of the vehicle causing the bicyclist to lose control, then that is a type of claim that can result in compensation. With all the bike lanes, road surfaces become more and more important. With creating these bike lanes, there's obligations on the city to make sure they're safe. We're heading into the winter in a few months. If a bike lane is not properly cleaned of snow and ice, that would be a potential claim against the city. As we've already discussed, there's more and more bikes. We're starting to see accidents involving 2 different bicyclists. Again, there's some avenues for compensating cyclists, even in those scenarios. In particular, if the at-fault bicyclist has some insurance, it could be either a tenant's package or a home insurance coverage, a home insurance package. Either of those packages or insurance coverages, tenants or home, has a what's called a third-party liability protection, and that's what would respond to the injury claim. Bike and pedestrians are bumping into each other and causing injuries, and that is a similar scenario to 2 bikes causing injury to one or the other. And then the last example I mentioned there is bikes with e-scooters or e-bikes. There's a somewhat unclear legislative provisions dealing with e-scooters, e-bikes. The variables or the technicalities of whether or not those motorized vehicles are required to have insurance is beyond the time that we have today. But there's certainly, as a minimum, a potential claim that an injured cyclist can have if they're hurt by an e-scooter or an e-bike. Next slide, please. Now, I often get calls from individuals who it's clear that they're 100% at fault, and most have the initial impression that because they're at fault, there's no possibility of compensation. And there absolutely is some avenues for compensation, and it may not be as much as someone who is not at fault, but there are certainly some avenues. Something that's not on the slide there is the list of other types of claims that we've already talked about. Some disability insurance, group or private, EI sick benefits, Canada pension, ODSP benefits. All of those are benefits that are available regardless of fault. Anytime there's a motor vehicle involved, then there's the additional potential entitlement to what we've called accident benefits. And again, that's one of the claims that we listed previously. I've given you some scenarios in the top 3 where there's an accident benefits coverage. potentially. And then the last example where there's no vehicle at all involved, then we're left with those, what I called other types of claims, um, um, assuming assuming there's a disability. Next slide, please. Now, with all the cycling cases that have come my way, you start to see patterns of types of accidents that result in injury to cyclists. Most cyclists are aware of these, but let's just talk about those for a minute. The dooring case is a fear of cyclists. You're biking along a row of parked cars, and unfortunately, someone doesn't look, and they swing a door open and cause an accident. Very common scenario. The next one is the right-hand turn situation, where the cyclist is riding along the right side of the vehicle, and again, the motorist is not paying attention and turns, cutting off or striking the cyclist. Many of those right-hand situations, the cyclist has actually not even had contact with the vehicle, but by trying to avoid contact, end up hurting themselves, falling off the bike, that kind of thing. A motorist making a left-hand turn in front of an oncoming cyclist is a very common one. Often those are quite serious accidents because of the opposing nature of the movement of the vehicle and the cyclist. And unfortunately, with left-hand turn cases, again, the collision tends to be more serious. And then the last one that I mentioned is where a motorist pulls out from a driveway and hits a cyclist. Many times they haven't checked for cyclists. They've checked for vehicles perhaps, but have not focused in on other people using the roadway. Next slide, please. Now, a subject that, may not be talked about so often by personal injury lawyers, and comes up in our time today, where we have more and more bicycles on the road, is that you may be sued. You may be causing an injury to somebody else, either a pedestrian or another cyclist, for example. And what happens when you're on the receiving end of a lawsuit? And that's a real risk based on the numbers of cyclists out there. It's a risk that might put your assets at risk, and by assets, it's not just money in the bank. It could be property that you own. It could be your stream of income, your gross earnings per year. Those are assets, and to protect those assets is something every cyclist should consider. If they live in a home with their family, then what's called third-party liability insurance will be there and will reply and respond to that kind of claim. But if they're not at home with their family and they're living on their own, and for example in the tenant situation, then there's a tenant's insurance package that they can buy. That I understand they're fairly reasonably priced and should seriously be considered. If a person owns their home or owns a condominium, for example, the standard policies that are purchased in those situations would have third-party liability insurance, and that liability insurance will protect and respond to claims that are brought if a cyclist causes injury to another. those are all my comments today. Thank you very much for joining us and listening to my comments on compensating cyclists.
Thanks, Tony. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what the process is like if somebody was, say, hurt on the road and was seeking compensation.
The process, interestingly, starts with the location of the accident. The gathering up of evidence can start immediately, and it's often very difficult for the cyclist who, especially if the injury is serious. But there's extremely valuable information in that's available at the scene, in particular independent witnesses. If the cyclist is not able to do that, if possible, they should seek out help from any bystander, to be honest, and try to gather up names of independent witnesses. There are many fact situations where who's at fault is not clear, and the more information we can gather at the scene, the better. Many cyclists have come in and they have their own GoPro on their helmet. Obviously, that's valuable evidence. Taking photographs with your phone at the scene, valuable. Taking short video clips, valuable, especially if you've got a driver who, with consent, is telling you what they saw or how the accident happened from their perspective. Anything that helps us to understand what happened and who's at fault, and that's the most important thing a cyclist can do. Now, the process of actually making a claim, we're not going to get into too much detail today. As we talked about, there's different types of claims, and each type of claim has its own process. I must say that the system is so complex that, in particular, someone with any type of serious injury, they're best advised to consult with a personal injury lawyer who has experience with cycling cases to help them through that process. Cases can take a long time and have many twists and turns. Some cases can be resolved within 2 years. Others can go up to 5 years or even longer, depending on the facts and the seriousness of the injury.
Thanks for that, Tony. And so I think what you're saying is that immediately after an accident or collision occurs, you should get the contact information for any witnesses or anybody who may have seen the accident, and also to take photos and record video. Is there anything else that you would recommend that people do right at the scene of the incident?
Well, we talked about the claim, and that's where I was focused, but the more important thing, to be frank, is taking care of themselves. The consideration for calling an ambulance, is very, very important depending on the seriousness of the injury. Nobody can help. Others can help with the gathering of independent witnesses, but the injured person needs to also say, yes, I want an ambulance. If their injuries warranted, to get themselves get some health care as quickly as possible.
Awesome. So then I think we'll open up the floor to participants so that we can answer their questions as well.
Certainly.